Good morning, everyone. I have my breakfast smoothie and I'm going to be canning and dehydrating today. Come and join me. I'm going to be canning a lot of tomatoes today. The first thing I do is wash the tomatoes. Now, if they're just from my garden, I usually just wash them because I know there's no chemicals and stuff on them. But since I purchased these, I want to soak them. I put about a teaspoon to a tablespoon of apple cider vinegar in a sink full of water and let them soak for about 5 minutes or so. And then I'll rinse them off. This helps to eliminate the mold and also remove some of the pesticides that might be on them. So after they soak for about 5 minutes, then I'll just rinse them off good. A caution about buying your tomatoes. My son has tourettes that's controlled 100% through diet. We thought that he was allergic to tomatoes because every time he had them, his tics got worse. His tics were actually to the point that they tested him for seizures. That's how bad his tourettes were. We kept him off of all tomato products, but he loves tomatoes. So when he snuck a tomato out of my garden one day and he did not react to it, it made me start doing a lot of investigation about tomatoes. I found out that they are picked green and then they are fogged to artificially ripen. This makes them firm and really pretty for sale at the grocery store. But you can't wash it off because it soaks through and penetrates the fruit. It was this chemical that he was reacting to and not the tomato. So now I only purchase tomatoes that I know have not been fogged. So as you're buying tomatoes, be careful where you get them from and ask a lot of questions about them. Make sure they're not fogged if at all possible. The method of canning tomatoes that I'm going to use today is the same that my great-grandmother used for decades. There's a lot of talk today and a lot of things online about having to use citric acid and lemon juice and stuff like that. She never did that, and all of her canning always turned out great. So I have stuck with her method because it's been proven in my family that it's worked. So that's the way I'm going to show you how to do canning tomatoes today. I want to make sure the jars are very sterilized, so I'm going to boil them in oil. Okay, so I'm not going to boil them in oil. You can do this a couple of different ways. You can submerge the jars fully in a pot of boiling water for about 10 minutes, or as I'm getting ready to do, I just line them up in my sink and then fill them with boiling water and let them sit for about 10 minutes. I just do this because I have so many jars to sterilize and I can do more at one time doing it this way. I'll be canning tomatoes in 2 different ways today. First, I'll be canning cut up pieces of tomatoes, and then I'm going to be canning tomato juice. So right now, I'm going to pick out all the nice tomatoes to use as the cut up tomatoes. I'll then use the tomatoes that have spots in them to turn into juice. The tomatoes need to be blanched so that the skins will come off easily. In order to do that, drop them in boiling water for about 30 to 60 seconds and then move them into ice cold water to let them cool so that they don't continue to cook. Allow them to cool in the ice water for about 15 to 30 seconds and then remove them. At this time, the skins should come off very easily. Then cut out the cores and any bad spots and cut them up into whatever size pieces that you want to process. After you've finished cutting all the pieces up, place them in a pot over medium-low heat and stir occasionally to prevent any sticking. One trick that you can use to help neutralize the enzyme that causes the solids in the water to separate during storage is to heat them up very quickly. So to do this, take some of the pieces of tomato and start cooking them, and then use a potato masher or some other device to mash them up. This will make kind of a soupy mix, and when that starts simmering to boiling, then start adding the whole chunks that you have into that. Do it a little at a time so that it heats up the pieces you threw in there quickly without cooling off the sauce too much. Once all the pieces of tomato has been added to the sauce, then bring it to a simmer. Now it's time to fill the jars. Each quart will get 1 teaspoon of salt, and each pint will get a half a teaspoon of salt. I like to pack them in there fairly firmly so that I get the most amount of food per jar, which means the most amount of food per storage space. As I was doing this video, I didn't put the salt in here until after I had already packed the jar. However, it's better to put the salt in the bottom of the jar, as I did with all the ones after this one. Fill the jars up to 1 inch from the top. I usually go by the bands on the jar. You can use a butter knife or a spoon or something like that to get all the air bubbles out. Go around all the way around the outside, and then also push down in the center as well. That helps eliminate the air bubbles before you start canning. You can dip the corner of a washcloth into boiling water to sanitize it, and then use that to wipe all the rims of the jars. As you're doing this, verify that there are no chips on any of the glass. Then install your lids and your bands and place them in your canner. For tomatoes, you want to use a water bath canner, not a pressure canner. After the water starts boiling, I will can quarts for about 30 minutes and pints for about 20 minutes. After that, I'll lift the rack up and allow them to sit for a little while, undisturbed. You don't want them to cool off too quickly, as this can force some of the liquid out of the jars as it's cooling. After I've let them cool in the pot for about 30 minutes to an hour, then I'll move them to a wire rack and cover them with a towel just to keep cool drafts off of it. Now that all the pieces of the tomatoes are canned, I'm going to process the tomato juice. To do this, I process the tomatoes in the beginning the same way, peeling them because they're not garden tomatoes but store-bought. If they were garden tomatoes, I wouldn't bother peeling them. Then cutting out the bad spots and the cores. Then cut them up into smaller pieces, place them in a pot, and bring them to a simmer. Now do not boil, but simmer them until all the pieces are soft. Ladle the now soft pieces into a sieve. Process through the sieve by turning it in both directions. This helps keep the holes from clogging up. With mine, this is hard to do one-handed. Continue processing all the tomato pieces, including the juice, through the sieve until all the liquid has been squeezed out. Fill all quart jars with a teaspoon of salt. Fill all pint jars with a half a teaspoon of salt. Now carefully ladle the juice into each jar, up to 1 inch from the top. Bring the water in the canner to a boil, then place all the jars in the canner and submerge. Once the water has returned to a boil, process pints for 20 minutes and quarts for 30 minutes, and then lift the jars back up and allow to cool in the canner for about 30 to 60 minutes before removing from the canner. Then place the jars on a rack, and cover them with a towel to prevent them from cooling too quickly. The following day, after all the jars have completely cooled, I will remove all of the bands and wash them in warm, soapy water to remove anything that may have leaked out through the seal during canning. Then I dry them and put the bands back on. Leaving the bands on helps support the seal from leaking at a future date. Then label them and store them.